That's a $5,000 fine, Mr. Davies. And if those lights aren't gone by morning, my lawyer will be attaching a lien to your house for every day they remain. Karen's voice, a weaponized blend of sugar and strychnine, sliced through the tranquil twilight air, her substantial frame planted on the public sidewalk just beyond my newly seeded lawn. Her floral muumuu, a riot of clashing pinks and purples, seemed to vibrate with self-righteous indignation as she pointed a trembling, sausage-like finger at the source of her fury. A set of 6 low-voltage LED landscape lights I had just finished installing along the flagstone path to my front door. They cast a warm, gentle glow, barely brighter than a full moon, designed more for safety and subtlety than for any kind of ostentatious display. But to Karen, president of the Oakmont Estates Homeowners Association, they were apparently a personal affront of the highest order, a declaration of war written in soft, 2,700 Kelvin light, the sheer absurdity of the threat, a lien on my home over pathway lights, felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me and replacing it with a cold, slow-burning anger. This wasn't a discussion. It was a decree from a petty tyrant in a polyester throne. If you think that's insane, and trust me, it gets a whole lot crazier, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or if you've ever had an HOA nightmare of your own that makes you want to tear your hair out. Because you haven't heard the half of it, and the story of how these little lights brought down an entire house of cards is one you're not going to want to miss. Now, where was I? Yes, my forever home. After 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, moving every few years from one dusty base to another, my wife Sarah and I had finally put down roots. We bought this house in Oakmont Estates because it seemed like the perfect slice of civilian quietude. Good schools, manicured lawns, a sense of community. Or so I thought. My entire career was built on precision, planning, and following protocols. I designed and oversaw the construction of infrastructure in places where a single miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. So when it came to my own home, my personal sanctuary, I applied the same meticulous discipline. Before I even purchased the lights, I had downloaded and read the 300-page HOA covenant, all of its amendments, and the Architectural Review Committee's guidelines. The document was a masterpiece of vague but threatening language, full of phrases like harmonious aesthetic and community standards, but utterly devoid of specific prohibitions on low-voltage landscape lighting. In fact, a clause in Article 4, Section 8, explicitly encouraged subtle, ground-level lighting for safety along pathways. I had my justification highlighted, printed, and ready. I had chosen dark sky compliant fixtures to prevent light pollution. I had buried the wiring 6 inches deep, as per code, even though it was low voltage and didn't strictly require it. I had done everything by the book, or at least by the book as it was written. But I was quickly learning that in Oakmont Estates, there was the book. And then there were the unwritten, ever-changing laws that existed only in the mind of HOA President Karen. This wasn't my first run-in with her, but it was the first time she had escalated from passive-aggressive notes about my recycling bin placement to outright financial warfare. Her house, a garish yellow 2-story directly across the street, served as her fortress and watchtower, from which she monitored the neighborhood for infractions with the vigilance of a prison guard. This time, however, she wasn't just writing a ticket. She was threatening to take my home, the very foundation of the peaceful life I had worked my entire adult life to build for my family. And as I stood there on my porch, the warm glow of my perfectly legal lights on the stone path, I felt the calm, cold resolve that had served me so well in hostile territory settle over me. This was not a fight I had asked for, but it was a fight I would be damned if I was going to lose. Karen had mistaken my desire for peace for weakness. It was a common mistake, and one she was about to regret. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs, forcing the initial surge of adrenaline to subside. In the Corps, they teach you that the first reaction is almost always the wrong one. You don't react, you assess, you orient, you decide, and then you act. Karen was still standing there, her arms crossed over her chest, a smug, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She expected me to yell, to argue, to crumble. I did none of those things. Instead, I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you for bringing your concerns to my attention, Karen, I said, my voice even and calm. I'll be sure to review the relevant bylaws again. Have a pleasant evening. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This wasn't the response she was prepared for. She wanted a fight, a screaming match on the lawn that she could later recount to the other board members as proof of my unsuitability for the community. I denied her the satisfaction. I turned, walked back into my house, and closed the door gently behind me, leaving her standing on the sidewalk in the gathering dusk, illuminated by the very lights she so despised. Sarah was in the kitchen, her face pale with worry. She had heard everything through the open window. Mark, what are we going to do? Aline, can she do that? I walked over and put my hands on her shoulders. She can threaten it, I said, looking her straight in the eye. But a threat is just a tool to get you to surrender before the fight even starts. We're not surrendering. I pulled out the thick binder I kept for the house, the HOA Bible. I flipped to the highlighted section on lighting and laid it on the kitchen island. Here it is. Subtle ground-level lighting for safety along pathways is encouraged. What I installed is the dictionary definition of that. But as I looked at it, I also saw the other clause, the one she would twist to her purpose. All exterior modifications must be harmonious with the general aesthetic of the community as determined by the Architectural Review Committee. And Karen, of course, was the self-appointed head of that committee. She was the judge, jury, and executioner of harmony. The next morning, the certified letter arrived. It was just as she promised. An official notice of violation from the HOA's law firm, citing a fine of $5,000 for an unapproved architectural modification, and stating that a fine of $100 per day would be assessed until the offending fixtures were removed. It was filled with intimidating legal phrases designed to terrify the average homeowner into immediate compliance. It mentioned the HOA's right to place a lien and even foreclose to collect unpaid fines and legal fees. It was extortion, plain and simple, wrapped in the veneer of legal authority. My blood ran cold, but my resolve hardened into steel. This was no longer a disagreement, it was a campaign. That afternoon I went for a walk. I didn't just walk, I conducted reconnaissance. I brought a small, high-resolution camera. I photographed every single house in the subdivision. I documented dozens of unapproved modifications, far more egregious than my lights. There were garish pink flamingos, peeling paint, basketball hoops left permanently on the curb, boats parked in driveways in clear violation of a specific rule, and a whole spectrum of hideous, mismatched, and blindingly bright solar lights. And then there was Karen's house. It was a monument to hypocrisy. She had blinking, multicolored rope lights framing her porch, a solar-powered, wobbling, bald eagle statue on her lawn, and a set of floodlights attached to her garage that were so powerful they could probably guide ships into port. I photographed it all, each picture a future piece of evidence. During my walk, I saw my neighbor, George, a quiet widower in his late 70s, tending to his rose bushes. I stopped to chat. I mentioned the letter I'd received. George sighed and shook his head, his shoulders slumping. "Be careful with that one, son," he said, his voice low. "She's a viper. A few years back, the Millers, the family in your house before you, she went after them because their mailbox was a shade of beige she didn't like. Drove them into the ground with fines and legal fees. They had to sell just to get out from under it. She bought their debt through a shell company and made a profit on the sale. That's her game. It's not about the rules, it's about power and money." The information hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a power trip. It was a predatory business model. She wasn't a neighborhood busybody. She was a shark circling for blood, and I was her next target. I went home and opened a new file on my computer, labeling it Operation Lighthouse. Phase 1 was complete. I had assessed the enemy. Now it was time to plan my counteroffensive. The arrival of the process server was almost theatrical. He was a lanky kid in a cheap suit, looking profoundly uncomfortable as he stood on my porch on a Saturday morning, holding a thick manila envelope. "Mark Davies," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. I signed for the documents, my hands steady. It wasn't a surprise, but the physical reality of the lawsuit, the crisp paper, the stark black font, the official stamp of the county court, still landed with a heavy thud in the pit of my stomach. The HOA, at the sole direction of its president, Karen, was officially suing me. The complaint was a work of fiction, painting me as a rogue homeowner, hell-bent on destroying the neighborhood's character with my 6 tasteful lights. It demanded the immediate removal of the lights, payment of the $5,000 fine, plus accrued daily fines, and, most chillingly, all of the HOA's legal fees, which I knew would be inflated to an astronomical sum. The final page contained the threat I knew was coming: a petition for the court to grant a foreclosure on my home to satisfy the debt. Sarah read it over my shoulder, her breath catching in a sob. "They're going to take our house," she whispered, her hands trembling. "Our home." I wrapped my arm around her and pulled her close. "No," I said, my voice low and firm, a commander's voice. "They are going to try. There's a difference. This is just paper, Sarah. It's an opening salvo. Now we get to fire back." I spent the rest of the weekend not in a panic, but in strategic planning. My military training had prepared me for asymmetrical warfare, for fighting a larger, seemingly more powerful entity by using its own weight and rules against it. Karen and the HOA had the legal high ground, or so they thought. My job was to dig under their position and collapse it from below. My first call on Monday morning was to Dave Miller, the owner of Spark Right Electrical. He was a grizzled former Navy Seabee I'd hired to consult on the lighting plan to ensure it was up to code, even though the low voltage meant it wasn't strictly necessary. Seabees are the builders and fighters of the Navy, and Dave had that practical, no-nonsense attitude. I explained the situation, the lawsuit, the foreclosure threat. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, then a low whistle. Foreclosure? Over path lights I know for a fact are top of the line and safer than a Christmas tree? That woman's got a screw loose. "That's putting it mildly, Dave," I replied. "Look, I need you to come over. I need a formal, written report on the installation. I need you to state, as a licensed master electrician, that the system is professionally planned, safe, and compliant with all national electrical codes. I'll pay for your time, of course." "Don't you worry about that," he grunted. "Consider it a professional courtesy. Fellow vet to fellow vet. I'll be there this afternoon. We'll get this squared away." Dave arrived in his work van, a rolling workshop filled with every tool imaginable. He meticulously inspected every connection, measured the voltage at each fixture, and took detailed photos. As he worked, I stood with him in my front yard, glancing across the street at Karen's house. Her curtains twitched, a sure sign she was watching our every move. As the sun began to set, my lights flickered on automatically. At the same moment, Karen's garish porch lights buzzed to life. One of them flickered erratically, like a dying firefly. Dave, packing up his multimeter, stopped and stared at it. "Huh," he said, squinting. "Look at that. Classic sign of a loose neutral or a bad connection in the box." He pointed his chin towards another part of her house. "And her garage floodlights are a different color temperature than the porch lights, but they're coming on at the same time. Bet you $100 they're all tied into the same switch with illegal splices. That's amateur hour right there, a real fire hazard." An idea, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to form in my mind. It was a long shot, a wild thought born of desperation and a thirst for poetic justice. "Dave," I said slowly, turning to face him, "theoretically, what other signs would point to amateur hour electrical work on a house like that?" Dave grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. He was starting to see where I was going. "Oh, the list is long," he said, rubbing his chin. "Mismatched outlets, switches that are warm to the touch, breakers that trip all the time. From the outside, you might see scorching around a meter box or exterior outlets that aren't GFCI protected, but the real horror show is always inside the walls and in the breaker panel." I looked from Dave's knowing smirk to Karen's house, which was now fully illuminated, a monument to bad taste and, just maybe, a tinderbox of code violations. The lawsuit wasn't just about my lights anymore. It was about her, and I had a feeling her entire world was about to get a whole lot brighter. "How would you know it's amateur hour from just looking?" I pressed, my mind racing, connecting dots I hadn't even seen a moment ago. Dave leaned against his van, happy to elaborate. He was a craftsman, and nothing offended a true craftsman more than shoddy, dangerous work. "It's a pattern," he explained, pointing with a screwdriver he was still holding. See the way that porch light fixture is mounted? It's slightly crooked, and there's a visible gap between the base and the siding. A pro would use a mounting block, caulk it, make it weatherproof and flush. That gap lets water in, right where the wires are. Recipe for a short. See the floodlights over the garage? They're cheap Home Depot specials, probably drawing 150 watts each. But the wire running to them, the bit you can see under the eave, looks like 14 gauge. Way too thin for that load, especially on a long run. That wire gets hot. It melts the insulation. It starts a fire in your attic. He was speaking my language. Not the language of electricity, but the language of systems, of failures, of critical vulnerabilities. Every structure, whether it's a military base or a suburban house, has weak points. Karen's weakness wasn't just her personality, it was her home. So, I said, the plan solidifying, if a person were to have done a lot of their own renovations without pulling permits, they would likely have a house full of this kind of stuff. Dave let out a short, sharp laugh. Brother, you have no idea. A guy who does his own work without permits is cutting corners everywhere. It's not just the electrical. It's the plumbing, the framing, the foundation. They do it to save a buck and avoid the inspector who would tell them they're doing it wrong. The whole house becomes a trap waiting to spring. My new mission was clear. I needed to prove that the enforcer of the rules was the biggest rule breaker of them all. This was no longer just a defense, it was a counterintelligence operation. I couldn't set foot on her property, but the public domain was fair game. The next morning, I was at the County Planning and Development Office when it opened. I filed a public records request for every permit, inspection report, and architectural plan ever submitted for the property at 124 Oakmont Lane. The clerk, a weary-looking woman who had clearly seen it all, processed my request with a bored sigh. Could take a few days, she said. I'll call you. 2 days later, she called. Mr. Davies, your file is ready. When I arrived, she handed me a folder so thin I thought it was a mistake. Is this everything? I asked. That's it, she confirmed. Since the house was built in 1998. I took the folder to a small table in the corner and opened it. Inside were exactly 3 documents. The original building permit from 1998, a plumbing permit for a water heater replacement in 2012, and a roofing permit from 2015. That was it. I sat there stunned. I knew Karen had lived in that house for at least 15 years. In the HOA's own folksy monthly newsletter, which she wrote herself, she had bragged extensively about her home improvement projects. This spring, my late husband Bob, a master of all trades, and I finally completed our beautiful new sunroom. One from 6 years ago read, another from 2 years ago detailed their complete kitchen gut and remodel. Just last year, she wrote about installing a luxurious new hot tub to soak away the stresses of serving the community. A sunroom, a full kitchen remodel, a hot tub. Each of those projects requires multiple permits. Electrical for the wiring, plumbing for the sink and dishwasher, building permits for structural changes, a dedicated circuit and permit for a high-draw appliance like a hot tub. There was nothing, not a single piece of paper. Her late husband, Bob, the master of all trades, had built a house of illegal modifications. And Karen, the queen of compliance, was living in it, lording her power over me for 6 tiny lights. The hypocrisy was so profound, it was almost beautiful. I now had the what, the lack of permits. But I still needed the how, the tangible proof of danger. An absence of paperwork wasn't as compelling as a clear and present risk. I needed to see inside those walls without ever stepping foot inside. I needed to make the invisible visible. I drove back to my house, the thin folder on the passenger seat feeling heavier than a slab of concrete. I called Dave. Dave, I need to hire you again, I said. But this time I don't need an electrician. I need a spy. A spy? Dave's voice crackled with amusement over the phone. I've been called a lot of things, but that's a new one. What's on your mind, Mark? I laid out the situation, the lack of permits, the extensive uninspected renovations, my need for concrete evidence of faulty work without committing trespass. I need your eyes, Dave, your professional eyes, and maybe some of your more advanced tools. There was a thoughtful pause. You know, he said slowly, I've got a thermal imaging camera, a new FLIR model. Use it to find hotspots in breaker panels and walls without having to open them up. Find overloaded circuits, bad connections, even water leaks. A thermal camera. It was perfect. It could see the heat bleeding through the walls, the telltale signatures of the dangerous wiring Dave had described. It was the next best thing to having X-ray vision. But I can't just stand in your yard and point it at her house, Dave continued. That's asking for trouble. We need a legitimate reason to be looking in that direction. My mind immediately went to my neighborhood reconnaissance. The house next door to Karen's, number 126, had a "for sale" sign in the yard. It had gone up last week. The house next to hers is on the market, I said. What if we were to schedule a viewing? Or better yet, what if I hired you to perform a pre-purchase electrical inspection on that house for a potential buyer? Dave let out a low whistle. That's thinking outside the box. We'd have a legitimate reason to be on the property, full access to the side of the house that faces hers. It's sneaky. I like it. I made the call to the realtor, posing as an interested buyer who was very serious and wanted to bring his own inspector for a preliminary look. We scheduled it for the following afternoon, a time when I knew Karen was usually home. The next day, Dave and I met the realtor at 126 Oakmont Lane. Dave was in his full work uniform, carrying a large case with his inspection tools. I was dressed in business casual, playing the part of the discerning homebuyer. The realtor, a young woman named Tiffany, was bubbly and eager. As she showed me the living room, Dave excused himself. "I'm just going to start my sweep of the exterior and the service panel," he said professionally. That was our cue. I kept Tiffany occupied for the next 20 minutes, asking her painfully detailed questions about the crown molding and the school district, all while my ears were strained, listening for Dave's work outside. From the second-story window of the guest bedroom, I had a clear line of sight. I saw Dave on the side lawn of the property, right up against Karen's fence line. He had the thermal camera out. It looked like a small, ruggedized camcorder. He wasn't pointing it overtly at her house. He was panning slowly, as if inspecting the side of the house we were in, but I knew he was capturing everything. He spent a long time aimed at the wall of her kitchen and the area where the new sunroom was attached. After a few more minutes, he came back inside, his face a mask of neutrality. "Everything looks pretty standard out there," he told the realtor. We finished the tour, thanked Tiffany for her time, and left. The moment we were in my car and out of sight, Dave's professional demeanor vanished. He was practically vibrating with a mixture of shock and professional glee. "Bingo," he said, pulling a tablet from his bag and tapping the screen. "We hit the mother lode." He showed me the images. On the screen, the normal thermal view of a house shows cool blues and greens. Karen's house, however, was a terrifying patchwork of angry reds and bright, glowing yellows. "Look at this," he said, zooming in on the wall of her kitchen. "These bright spots are the outlets. They're running incredibly hot. And this line here, that's a wire run inside the wall, glowing like a hot coal. He probably used wire that was too small for the circuit, or there are unboxed splices in the wall. Either way, that is a full-blown, 5-alarm fire waiting to happen." He swiped to another picture, this one showing the exterior wall where the main breaker panel was located. The whole area was a smear of orange. "The panel is overloaded, massively. She's got way too many circuits running, probably doubled-up breakers. It's an electrical octopus from hell." He showed me another image of the area near her back deck. A bright hot line snaked out from the house towards the hot tub. "And there's your unpermitted hot tub wiring. He's run an interior-grade Romex cable outside, probably just buried an inch or two under the sod. It's not rated for outdoor use. The insulation will degrade, water will get in, and then zap. Someone's going to get a very nasty surprise." The evidence was stunning. It was undeniable. It was a picture of a house on the verge of self-immolation, all because of shoddy, illegal work. I had her. The binder for Operation Lighthouse was getting thicker. I had the permit records. I now had a thermal imaging report from a licensed master electrician documenting multiple severe fire hazards. But I needed one more thing. I needed to bring the community into it. I started talking to my other neighbors, Not about Karen directly, but about shared concerns. I'd catch them while they were getting their mail or walking their dog. I'd bring up the rising cost of homeowners insurance. You know, I'd say casually, I was talking to my insurance guy, and he said that one major fire in a neighborhood can cause everyone's rates to skyrocket for years, even if your house isn't touched. That got their attention. Then I'd pivot. Makes you think about all the old wiring in these houses, especially with people doing their own DIY work. It was planting a seed, and it worked. My other next-door neighbor, a young couple named the Patels, mentioned that their lights always flickered and dimmed whenever they heard Karen's hot tub jets turn on. They'd been worried about it but didn't want to cause trouble. I told them to document it, to write down every time it happened. I was building a chorus of concern. Karen thought she was fighting a war against one man and his lights. She had no idea she was about to be fighting the entire neighborhood, armed with the truth she had hidden inside her own walls. Armed with a folder that now felt like a tactical briefcase, I knew my next move couldn't be another conversation or a letter. It was time to bring in heavy artillery. The lawsuit filed by Karen's HOA was an act of aggression that required a strategic legal response, not just a defense. I needed a lawyer who understood the unique pathology of HOA disputes, someone who saw them not as petty squabbles, but as serious battles over property rights and abuse of power. After a day of research and a few phone calls, I found her. Ms. Evelyn Albright, a partner at a downtown firm with a reputation as a dragon slayer in the world of property law. Her firm's website was filled with testimonials from homeowners she'd saved from foreclosure and tyrannical HOA boards she'd dismantled. The consultation was in a high-rise office with a panoramic view of the city, a world away from the manicured lawns of Oakmont Estates. Mrs. Eyes or None. Albright was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I immediately respected. She listened patiently, without interruption, as I laid out the entire story, starting with the lights and Karen's initial threat, and ending with the thin folder of permits and the damning thermal images from Dave. I arranged the documents on her large mahogany desk, the HOA's lawsuit, my photos of my lights and the neighborhood's other violations, the highlighted bylaws, the county permit search results, and finally Dave's thermal report, with the glowing, hazardous images of Karen's house. She picked up the thermal report, her eyebrows raising slightly. She slowly flipped through the pictures, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to a kind of grim satisfaction. When she was done, she placed the report down gently, folded her hands, and looked me straight in the eye. "Mr. Davies," she said, a small, sharp smile touching her lips, "this is a gift, an absolute gold-plated gift." I must have looked confused because she elaborated. "Most of my cases involve fighting vague covenants or procedural errors. It's a grind. What you have here, this is different. This isn't a lawsuit about lights. This is a case of malicious prosecution and gross negligence. And you've just handed me the evidence to prove it on a silver platter." She leaned forward, her voice dropping, filled with strategic intensity. "Here is what we are not going to do. We are not going to simply file a defense arguing that your lights are harmonious. That's a subjective argument that a judge could go either way on. We are not going to get into a mudslinging contest about her ugly porch decorations. That makes us look petty." "So what do?" I asked. "We use her lawsuit against her," Ms. Albright declared. "She has initiated a legal process. That process has rules. One of those rules is called discovery. It allows us to demand evidence and information from the opposing party. We are going to file a motion for discovery, but not for her emails or notes. We are going to petition the court to compel a full on-site inspection of her property by a licensed neutral third party." The beautiful, brutal simplicity of it hit me. We would use the legal system she had weaponized against me to legally invade her fortress and expose her secrets. Her entire claim to authority as HOA president, Ms. Albright continued, her voice like sharpened steel, is predicated on her role as the enforcer of the community's rules and standards for the safety and betterment of all residents. We are going to demonstrate to the court that the plaintiff, in this case, is not only failing to uphold those standards, but is actively, knowingly, and dangerously violating them on a scale that endangers the entire community. Her hypocrisy doesn't just undermine her moral authority, it obliterates her legal standing to bring this lawsuit in the first place. The strategy was brilliant. It shifted the focus from my little lights to her massive liability. And there's more, she said, a predatory glint in her eye. We are going to name every single member of the HOA board as co-defendants in a countersuit. We will allege that they have been grossly negligent in their fiduciary duty to the community by allowing their president to operate with impunity, exposing every homeowner to increased fire risk and potential liability. We will inform them that their directors and officers' insurance policy is likely void due to this level of negligence, meaning they will be personally on the hook for damages. This was the kill shot. It wasn't just about taking on Karen, it was about dismantling her power structure. The other board members were likely just her cronies or, worse, complacent bystanders who went along to get along. The threat of personal financial ruin would shatter their loyalty in an instant. But we don't file the countersuit yet, she instructed, holding up a finger. That's our ace in the hole. First, we let the discovery and the inspection play out. We let the evidence speak for itself. But before that, you have an opportunity to land a blow in a different arena, the court of public opinion. She looked at her calendar. The HOA's monthly meeting is next Tuesday, correct? I nodded. You need to be there, she said, and you need to ask a question. The air in the community clubhouse was thick with cheap coffee and a palpable sense of tension. The monthly HOA meetings were usually sparsely attended, a drab affair where Karen would drone on about lawn maintenance and holiday decoration schedules. But tonight the room was packed. Word had spread like wildfire. The lawsuit against me was the talk of the neighborhood, and people had come for the drama. I saw the Patels, the young couple from next door, sitting near the back, giving me a subtle nod. I saw George, my elderly neighbor, in the front row, his expression grim but resolute. And in the center of it all, at a long folding table, sat Karen and the three other board members, a trio of nervous-looking individuals who seemed to wish they were anywhere else. Karen, however, was in her element. She thrived on this. She banged a small gavel, a self-important flourish, and called the meeting to order. She began with a smug, thinly veiled speech about the importance of preserving the unique character and high standards of Oakman Estates. She spoke of difficult but necessary actions taken to protect property values from the selfish actions of a few who believe the rules don't apply to them. Her eyes flicked towards me as she said it, a clear and public indictment. I remained perfectly still, my face a neutral mask. I let her have her moment. I let her dig her own hole a little deeper. The meeting dragged on through the treasurer's report and the landscaping committee update. Finally, Karen announced, "We will now open the floor for homeowner comments. Please keep your statements to 2 minutes." This was my moment. I stood up. A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on me. I wasn't holding a thick binder or a stack of papers. I was holding a single folded sheet. It was a list of questions Ms. Albright and I had prepared. I walked calmly to the small podium set up for residents. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady and clear, projecting to the back of the room. "Mark Davies, 121 Oakmont Lane. I don't have a statement. I have a few questions for the board, specifically regarding the HOA's insurance and liability." I saw a flicker of panic in the eyes of the other board members. This was not the topic they were expecting. Karen's smile tightened. "Mr. Davies, this is not the appropriate forum to discuss your personal legal disputes," she said dismissively. "My questions are not about my personal disputes," I countered, my voice unwavering. "They are about the financial and physical safety of every single homeowner in this room. My first question is the board aware of whether our community's directors and officers insurance policy covers acts of gross negligence by a board member?" The treasurer, a man named Stan, nervously shuffled his papers. "Well, I'd have to check the specifics of the policy." "Please do," I said politely. "Because my second question is this. What is the board's protocol when it becomes aware that a board member's property contains numerous, severe, and unpermitted building, electrical, and plumbing violations that constitute a documented fire hazard to the immediate neighbors and a potential liability for the entire association?" The room erupted in murmurs. I hadn't accused anyone by name. I had simply asked a procedural question. but everyone knew exactly who and what I was talking about. Karen's face went from smug to a blotchy, furious red. "That is an outrageous and unsubstantiated accusation," she sputtered, slamming her hand on the table. "You have no proof." "It wasn't an accusation, Karen," I said, using her first name for the first time, my voice dropping into a cold, hard register. "It was a question, but since you've brought it up, let me ask the board a more direct question." I turned my body to address the other three members, ignoring Karen completely. "Are you, as fiduciaries of this community, aware that the property at 124 Oakmont Lane has undergone extensive renovations, including a sunroom addition and a full kitchen remodel, with no permits filed with the county? Are you aware that a high-draw hot tub has been installed with no dedicated electrical permit? And are you aware that a recent thermal imaging survey of the property revealed multiple extreme fire hazards due to overloaded circuits and improper wiring, posing a direct threat to the homes on either side?" I let the words hang in the dead silent room. I could see the blood draining from the faces of the other board members. They were looking at Karen not with loyalty, but with dawning horror. They were connecting the dots, the risk, the liability, their own personal exposure. "I'm not here to talk about my landscape lights," I concluded, my voice resonating with calm authority. "I'm here, as a member of this community, to ask what this board intends to do about a ticking time bomb in our midst before it burns down half the neighborhood and bankrupts the rest of us." I turned, walked back to my seat, and sat down. The spell was broken. The room exploded into a cacophony of questions and panicked chatter aimed at the board. Karen banged her gavel uselessly, her authority evaporating before her very eyes. I had not only declared war, I had just won the first decisive battle. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and catastrophic for Karen. The seeds of doubt I had planted blossomed into a full-blown insurrection. The other board members, Stan the treasurer in particular, were bombarded with phone calls and emails from panicked homeowners. The illusion of Karen's benevolent dictatorship was shattered, replaced by the terrifying specter of personal liability. Ms. Albright, true to her word, had wasted no time. The day after the meeting, she filed our motion to compel an inspection of 124 Oakmont Lane. The motion was accompanied by our evidence: the county permit report, Dave's detailed thermal imaging analysis, complete with the terrifying pictures and sworn affidavits from the Patels about the power fluctuations, and from George about Karen's history of predatory litigation. Karen's lawyer, a slick but ultimately outmatched attorney from a suburban strip mall, filed a response calling our motion a frivolous, retaliatory, and wholly inappropriate fishing expedition designed to harass and intimidate his client. It was a weak boilerplate defense, and we knew it. The hearing was 2 weeks later. It was a short, brutal affair. We sat at one table, calm and prepared. Karen and her lawyer sat at the other, looking flustered. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Judge Miller, read through the filings. She looked at the lawsuit over my lights, then at the thermal images showing Karen's house glowing like a hot plate. She peered over her glasses at Karen's lawyer. "Counselor," she said, her voice dripping with impatience, "your client is the president of a homeowners association, suing a resident for foreclosure over aesthetic lighting, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said confidently. "And you are arguing," the judge continued, "that I should deny the defendant's request to inspect your client's property for potential safety violations, which he has provided preliminary evidence for, because it's a fishing expedition?" "It's an invasion of her privacy, Your Honor. It has no bearing on the original complaint." The judge leaned back in her chair and let out a sigh of profound disbelief. "Counselor, your client's entire legal standing in her complaint is based on her position as an enforcer of community rules for safety and property value. The allegation here is that she is the single greatest threat to safety and property value in the entire neighborhood. That has every bearing on this case. Motion to compel is granted. A city-appointed neutral inspector will conduct a full structural, electrical, and plumbing inspection of the plaintiff's property within 10 days. The defendant's own expert may be present as an observer. Schedule it with my clerk." It was a complete and total victory. Karen sat there, her face ashen, her mouth slightly agape. She had flown too close to the sun, and the legal system she thought was her personal weapon had just turned on her with a vengeance. The day of the inspection was a cinematic masterpiece of bureaucratic justice. A white van from the City Code Enforcement Department pulled up in front of Karen's house precisely at 9 a.m. A grim-faced, barrel-chested inspector named Mr. Henderson emerged, clipboard in hand. I was there with Ms. Albright. Dave, my electrician, was there too, tool belt on, ready to observe. Karen stood on her porch looking pale and shrunken in a drab gray sweatsuit. Her lawyer was beside her, looking like he'd rather be having a root canal. The tour of horrors began in the basement. Mr. Henderson took one look at the breaker panel and just shook his head slowly. It was exactly as Dave had predicted. A chaotic mess of wires, multiple circuits crammed onto single breakers, and scorch marks on the panel cover. This is an immediate fire hazard, he stated flatly, making a note on his clipboard. He pointed to a web of exposed wires snaking across the ceiling. Illegal splices everywhere. None of this is in conduit. That's a gut job. He moved to the sunroom. He took out a long screwdriver and poked at the point where the addition met the main house. It was soft. Improper flashing, he grunted. He went outside and kicked one of the deck blocks supporting the structure. It shifted in the soft soil. This isn't a foundation. It's a suggestion. The whole structure is unstable. The kitchen was the grand finale. Mr. Henderson unscrewed the cover of a light switch. Inside, there was no junction box. The switch was just floating in the drywall, with bare wires twisted together with electrical tape. Oh, for crying out loud, he muttered, a rare show of emotion. This is the kind of thing that kills people. He went from outlet to outlet using his tester. Most weren't grounded. The one for the refrigerator was on the same circuit as the microwave and the dishwasher. Finally, he went to the backyard to inspect the infamous hot tub. He followed the buried wire Dave had spotted, easily unearthing it with the toe of his boot. He saw the standard interior-grade Romex cable, its white plastic sheath already becoming brittle from sun and moisture. He looked at the connection to the hot tub's motor, a mess of wire nuts wrapped in tape and exposed to the elements. He didn't even need to write it down. He just turned to Karen, his face a granite mask of disapproval. "Ma'am," he said, his voice devoid of any sympathy, "I am red tagging this entire property. It is officially declared uninhabitable due to imminent and multiple safety hazards. The utility company will be here within the hour to disconnect your electrical service. Power will not be restored until every single one of these violations, and I assure you, the list will be long, is brought up to current code, re-inspected, and approved by my office." Karen swayed on her feet, grabbing her lawyer's arm for support. She had been so obsessed with the 6 tiny lights in my yard that she never realized her own house was a death trap, and now the entire world knew it. The red tag, a large angry-looking sticker, was slapped onto her front door. It was a public declaration of her failure, a scarlet letter of hypocrisy for the whole neighborhood to see. The war was over. All that was left was to sort through the wreckage. The aftermath of the inspection was a swift and brutal unraveling for Karen. The city inspector's official report was a 30-page document detailing over 100 separate code violations. The estimated cost to bring the house up to code was, as Ms. Albright gleefully informed me, well into the 6-figure range. It would require gutting the kitchen, the basement, and the sunroom down to the studs, rewiring the entire house, and pouring a proper foundation for the addition. Karen was trapped. With the house officially red-tagged and declared uninhabitable, she couldn't live in it. She couldn't sell it, except for pennies on the dollar to a developer who would just tear it down. And she couldn't get a home equity loan or a construction loan to pay for the repairs because the property, in its current state, had no collateral value. Her asset had become a massive, unpayable liability overnight. Simultaneously, the HOA began to implode. The moment the red tag went up, the other 3 board members convened an emergency meeting without Karen. Faced with Miss Albright's pending countersuit and the threat of being held personally liable for Karen's negligence, their decision was swift. All 3 resigned, effective immediately. Stan, the treasurer, hand-delivered a letter to every home in the neighborhood, explaining the board's dissolution and detailing the shocking revelations about the unacceptable risks posed by the former president's property. It was a masterclass in covering his own hide, but it had the desired effect. Karen was left completely isolated, a queen without a court, a general without an army. Her lawsuit against me, now rudderless without a functioning HOA board to back it, was dead in the water. Her own lawyer, likely realizing he was never going to get paid, formally withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences. The court officially dismissed the HOA's suit against me with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. It was a quiet, anticlimactic end to the legal battle that had threatened my home. But the war wasn't quite over. Now we were on the offensive. Ms. Albright filed our countersuit, not against the now defunct HOA, but against Karen personally. We sued for malicious prosecution, abusive process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We had an ironclad case. We had the lawsuit she filed, the history of her predatory behavior from George's affidavit, and the clear evidence that her suit was a hypocritical smokescreen to hide her own gross misconduct. Faced with total financial ruin from the house repairs and now a personal lawsuit that could bankrupt her 10 times over, Karen had no fight left in her. A new lawyer, a specialist in damage control and settlements, contacted Ms. Albright within a week. They wanted to settle, and they wanted to do it fast. The negotiation was not a negotiation. It was a dictation of terms. Ms. Albright was merciless. The settlement agreement was a work of art, a document of pure poetic justice. First, Karen had to pay every single dollar I had spent on my legal defense, a sum that was not insignificant. Second, she was required to pay for Dave's time, both for the initial consultation and for his expert spy work with the thermal camera. Third, and this was Ms. Albright's masterstroke, she had to write a formal letter of apology to me and Sarah for the harassment and distress she had caused. That letter was not to be sent privately. The settlement stipulated that it must be printed and distributed at her own expense to every single homeowner in Oakman Estates. The final condition was the most deliciously ironic. The settlement amount for damages, a tidy 5-figure sum, was structured so that she would pay it directly to the city planning department to cover the mountain of fines and penalties she had incurred for her years of unpermitted construction. Her punishment was to use her own money to pay for the consequences of the very rule-breaking she had tried to pin on me. She had no choice but to sign. A few weeks later, the letter of apology arrived in our mailboxes. It was a humiliating, stilted piece of writing, clearly drafted by a lawyer, but the words were there. She admitted her actions were unwarranted and based on a personal animus rather than a legitimate concern for the community. It was a public confession of everything we knew to be true. The final nail in the coffin came a month after that. A new for sale sign appeared in her yard. Not the glossy kind from a realtor, but a cheap, generic one from the hardware store with the words, "As is, land value only," scrawled on it in marker. She sold the house, her castle, for a fraction of what it had once been worth to a construction company that, a week later, showed up with a bulldozer. I watched from my living room window as the machine tore into the garish yellow siding, reducing the house of horrors to a pile of splintered wood and broken drywall in less than a day. The symbol of her tyranny, the watchtower from which she had terrorized the neighborhood, was gone. The seasons changed. Spring turned to a warm, golden summer. Where Karen's monstrous yellow house once stood, there was now just an empty lot, a patch of bare earth waiting for a new beginning. The developer who bought it had already submitted plans to the county, fully permitted, of course, for a modest, tasteful home that would actually fit the neighborhood's character. The air in Oakman Estates felt different. It was lighter. The oppressive weight of Karen's reign was gone, replaced by a sense of communal relief and renewal. An interim HOA board had been formed, and my quiet, rose-tending neighbor George had been unanimously elected as the new president. His first act was to call a special meeting, not in the stuffy clubhouse, but as a potluck barbecue in the community park. At that barbecue, with the smell of grilled burgers in the air and children playing on the grass, the neighbors formally voted to overhaul the HOA covenants. Ms. Albright, whom I'd recommended, had been hired by the new board to help redraft the documents. The vague, weaponized language was stripped away, replaced with clear, concise, and reasonable rules that focused on safety and the genuine preservation of property values, not on the personal whims of a single individual. The power of the Architectural Review Committee was diluted, requiring a majority vote of the entire board for any fine to be levied, and a clear, simple appeals process was established for homeowners. It was a quiet revolution, born from a fight over 6 small lights. One evening, I was out in my front yard, kneeling down to adjust the angle of one of the pathway lights, the very same ones that had started it all. They cast their warm, gentle glow on the flagstones, a beacon of defiance that had become a symbol of victory. Sarah came out and sat on the porch steps, holding 2 tall glasses of iced tea, condensation beating on the sides. "They look beautiful, honey," she said, her voice soft and content. I stood up, wiping the dirt from my hands, and sat down next to her. We looked out at our peaceful street, at the empty lot across the way where a new family would soon build their own dream, at the neighbors strolling by who now waved and smiled with genuine warmth. The fear was gone. "You know," Sarah said, "I was so scared. I really thought we were going to lose this place." "I know," I said, taking her hand, "but sometimes you can't back down. Sometimes you have to hold your ground, not just for you, but for everyone who doesn't have the strength or the resources to fight back." I thought about the Millers, the family who had lived here before us, driven out by the same tyranny over something as trivial as a mailbox color. This victory wasn't just for us. It was for them, too. It was for the Patels, who could now run their dishwasher without their lights flickering. It was for George, who could finally enjoy his retirement without a predator watching from across the street. The fight had been ugly and stressful, a diversion from the quiet life I had craved. But in the end, it had brought something better than quiet. It had brought justice. It had forged a real community out of a collection of houses. It had taught me that the principles I lived by in the military, discipline, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to doing the right thing, especially when it's hard, were just as applicable here on the home front. I took a long sip of my iced tea. The light from my pathway lamps was soft, unassuming, and perfectly harmonious. It was the light of peace, a peace I had been forced to fight for, and one that now finally felt truly and irrevocably earned. The battle was over, and the lights were still on.